Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about a serial killer case from Nigeria, and it is extremely famous in Nigeria. It's also pretty recent. I'm pretty sure everyone in the entire country knows about it. Before we get started, as a content warning, again, this is a serial killer case that is about murder. If you do not wish to hear about that right now, I totally understand. Please go ahead and click out of the video. If you do want to hear the story, I will go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, this case takes place in Nigeria, which is a country in West Africa with a population of about 214 million people. It's also a former British colony. By the way, the country just north of Nigeria is pronounced Niger because it was a French colony, and so it has a more French sounding name. The specific area of Nigeria we're going to be talking about is called the Niger Delta. This is all the way down in the southern part of Nigeria, and this area has been plagued with violence for a very long time now, which I will get to later. In the late summer of 2019, the police in Port Harcourt had a major problem. Port Harcourt is the 5th largest city in Nigeria, and it's the capital of River State. And women were being strangled to death in hotels there. Hotel employees were walking in and finding women who were tied up at their necks, wrists, and ankles with white cloth. And by the time they found them, whoever had done this was long gone. And they had no idea who was doing this because this person was purposely choosing hotels that were maybe a little bit more run down and on the outskirts of town, and which did not have security cameras. The police said that these murders appeared to be what they called ritual killings because of the white cloth. A ritual killing would mean that there was some element of witchcraft with these murders, but I actually couldn't find any more evidence supporting that theory. The police also thought that there were multiple accomplices working together, and I will get to that part later as well. The first victim was identified on August 1st, 2019, as Precious Maureen Ewuru. Maureen was just 23 years old, and she left a baby girl behind. She was found strangled to death in a hotel in Port Harcourt. The night before, she had made a reservation and was later joined by a man who the hotel employees thought to be her boyfriend. But again, the next morning, her boyfriend was nowhere to be found. Maureen's friend told The Guardian that Maureen was a tender-hearted person who had a lot of dreams. On August 15th, another body was found in a hotel in Port Harcourt. She was identified as Jennifer Nwokocha. She was a student who was applying to the University of Port Harcourt. She was from Omoku, which is another town in River State. Apparently, Jennifer had run into the killer at this hotel where she was staying, and he had offered her 10,000 naira, which is the Nigerian currency, plus a barbecue dinner to spend the night with him. And she took him up on this offer only to be murdered by him. By the way, after this second murder, there was a lot of victim blaming going on in the media and by the police. The police were on TV telling women not to prostitute themselves. And I just want to say for the record, it does not matter if these women were prostituting themselves or not. They shouldn't have been murdered, period. And I don't want to hear any judgments about them because we don't know what their circumstances were. On September 9th, the killer struck again. He murdered 18-year-old Nikki Dora. This is Nikki, and I just have to say from her photos, she looks like she has so much personality, and she was such a funny person. I am so sorry for her family and all the other families. I'm going to read you a Facebook post from a person who says she was Nikki's sister. I found this post on a Nigerian website that has forums where people make posts. I've edited the post just a little bit for clarity. It says, "The customer lodged there at the hotel where Nikki worked. Nikki and the second girl went to attend to the guests, who had asked the staff to bring their menu, which they did. The second girl explained the menu to them. They demanded a bottle of water, which my sister Nikki went to get. By then, they had already killed the other girl who had been explaining the menu to them. My sister came back, knocked on the door. then opened it and went inside. They covered her mouth immediately with a white handkerchief and a white powder-like substance. One was tying her hands backwards, and she struggled with them, but they overpowered her. They brought her home, and she was still breathing, which is how she explained what happened. Please don't say she was a prostitute. She was just 18. The second girl was just 17. Now, there's several aspects of Nikki's case that make it a little bit unique. First of all, sadly, Nikki and her sister were orphans, and it sounded like they were in charge of taking care of at least one younger sister. So it sounded like the family had already been through a lot of trauma. Second, the second victim that's mentioned here, the 17-year-old, is not on the killer's list of victims. And I don't know why not, because it sounds like it was very obvious that that's what happened. So I have no idea why she's not on there. The only thing I can think of is if the dates were wrong, because the other victims on the list, which I'll get to later, all have different dates from Nikki's date of death, which was September 9th. So of course, the 17-year-old girl also would have had the date of September 9th, but there's no one else listed with that date. Now, the third point about this is that it sounds like there were multiple accomplices. And while I have read that the police suspected that, and that in fact the day that they arrested the killer, they also arrested someone else, but it sounded like maybe they let him go, I have not found anything else about there being an accomplice. But certainly this is secondhand information that was told to the victim's sister by the victim herself. And if that's true, that's extremely important to this case. Fourth, Nikki's sister describes her as having died in a church. So it sounds like they started to kill Nikki, they didn't kill her, somehow someone took her home, and from home she somehow got to a church where she died. And it sounds like maybe churches are serving as substitutes for emergency rooms there. I'm not sure. If anyone has more information about that particular item, please leave a comment. There was one survivor of the killer, and her name was Benita Etim. She was a 23-year-old sex worker who got a room with the killer, and they went into the room, and he started to turn the TV up extremely loud. And Benita didn't want to hear that, but the killer told her that he was hard of hearing. And once he had the TV volume up so loud, he proceeded to rape her. And nobody could hear her screaming, both because of the TV and because there was a power generator right next to their room. After he raped Benita, he tied her up in the same exact way that he tied his other victims up. But Benita begged him not to kill her. And I guess he had some tiny shred of humanity, because he actually didn't. He actually just took her phone, left the room, and never came back. So Benita was left struggling all night, and by the morning she finally got the tie or gag out of her mouth, and that's when the hotel employees could actually hear her screaming and came to rescue her. So there's a documentary about this case on YouTube, and it has a lot of interviews. I would definitely recommend watching it if you're interested in this case. But the police chief, I believe his title is Commissioner of Police for River State Police Command. Sorry if that's not totally correct. Basically, this guy was in charge of the police for the entire state. And so he was on this case, especially as the killings increased. And he actually says in this documentary that the police arrested the managers and receptionists at these hotels where the killings had happened. They arrested them and detain them for some period of time. I don't know how long, but I thought that was really interesting. So after they detained those people, the police commander had a big meeting with the Hotel Owners Association members of River State, and he told them that they had to install security cameras. They had to do it, or he was going to come arrest them too. Now, in that Nigerian forum site that I was looking at, of course, there were people arguing about whether that was legal or not, and I don't know if it was or not. But telling them that they had to install the cameras was actually helpful, which we will get to later. By September 18th, 2019, 8 women had been found murdered in this way, and the public was absolutely terrified. There was a sense that the police weren't doing enough to stop this. And there was also a sense that men were blaming women for being murdered. That day, 70 women staged a protest in Port Harcourt, and I watched some of the footage of this protest, and I thought they did a great job. They put a lot of heart and soul into this protest. But unfortunately, that same night, a ninth victim was murdered, and her name was Patience Hamo. But this time, it was different, because this time, there was actually security camera footage of the killer. Finally. So this footage is actually on Instagram, and basically it's a hotel. It looks very normal, and the killer comes in with the victim. The victim sits down. The killer, talks to the front desk people and pays for the room. And then they go back to the room, and there's a little bit of back and forth. But they knew that this was him because, of course, in the morning they found Patience Hamo's body, and they could see that it was the same woman in the video and that the killer was with her and who he was. So as soon as that happened, police went through this footage and found the video of him and put up a picture of him, and this picture went viral all over social media in Nigeria. And so now suddenly everyone knows what this guy looks like. So everyone was on the lookout for him, especially in Rivers State. People started reporting to the police that they had seen him on a specific road. So the police shut down that road. They put a blockade in that road, and they had security personnel look in every single bus, truck, car, every vehicle passing along that road. And that's how they found him. And guess what? He was wearing the same clothing that he had been wearing in the video. He hadn't even changed his clothes since the night before. He was found in the very back of a commercial bus. When this happened, there was actually a little bit of skepticism from the public because it just seemed too fast and too perfect. They were kind of wondering, was this really him or not? Had the police just pinned this on somebody random? But when they arrested him, he confessed. So the killer was actually a 40-year-old man by the name of Gracious David West. First name Gracious, last name David-West. And he confessed almost immediately when he was caught. He confessed to killing 15 women. Most of them were around Port Harcourt, but he had also killed women in other parts of Nigeria too. The day after they arrested him, they paraded him in front of journalists, which I guess is a thing that they do there so that all the journalists can get pictures. Now, aside from the victims that I already told you about, there isn't much information about the rest of them, but I am going to read you their names and dates that they were murdered. Linda Waripa, September 6th. Rose Samuel, September 12th. Kalechi Bridget Onyoha, who was killed on September 13th. And two that don't have dates, Blessing Effiong and Antonia Ibe. So let's talk about Gracious David West. Gracious David West was born on February 17th, 1980 in Buguma, which is a fishing town in River State. It's known for its beaches. There was one source that said he was a father of one, and another source that said he had 3 children. One was 17, and the other 2 were 4 and 6. I'm not sure if either of those are correct. Gracious David West himself was an only child born into a polygamous home, but he and his mother lived separately from the rest of the family. I did look up some statistics about polygamy worldwide, just for everyone's information. 28% of households in Nigeria are polygamous, and the number is 11% in sub-Saharan Africa overall. But worldwide, just 2% of households are polygamous. Now, aside from this being another horrible story about a male serial killer killing women, there were 2 sentences in the BBC article that I read about this case that really grabbed my attention. I'll read them for you now. They were, "The town," meaning Buguma, where Gracious David West was from, has a history with oil militants who operated out of its numerous mangrove swamps at the height of the oil militancy in Nigeria's Niger Delta in the early 2000s. That's when Gracious David West would have been in his early 20s. Police say David West was a member of the Greenlanders, also known as DBAM, a mafia-style street gang that sprung out of the armed militant groups. When I read that he was a member of something called the Greenlanders, I was just wondering what on earth that could mean. Like, are these people trying to be Vikings? Did he think he was a Viking? And so I started researching that, and I came up with a lot of information. So we're going to talk about the history of this region for a little bit, just to understand the context about this Greenlander and oil militant thing. Nigeria gained its independence from Great Britain in 1960. And just a couple of years before that, the Royal Dutch Shell Company had found oil off the coast of Nigeria. There had been people looking for this oil for 50 years. So after 50 years, they finally found this oil. But in 1969, the federal government passed a law saying that all of the revenue from oil would go straight to them. It would go straight to the federal government. It would bypass the people who actually lived in the land where the oil was found. And that land is called the Niger Delta. And it's actually the home of different ethnic groups, but the main one, the most populous one, are the Ijaws. And so sometimes this land is referred to as Ijaw land because it's their ancestral home. Now, traditionally, the Ijaws' economic activities were subsistence farming and fishing. But because of all the oil drilling going on there, they can't do that anymore. There's no room for them in the ocean to actually do that. Nothing has really replaced those jobs. There's a very low level of industrialization in the Niger Delta. So this area has a lot of problems. About 70% of people who live there are poor. Their medical system isn't very good. There aren't enough roads. Apparently, it costs 4 times as much to build a road along a coast as it does on normal dry land. Their infant mortality and maternal morbidity rates are really high, among the highest in the world. There's not a lot of actual learning going on in the school system, according to what I read. But perhaps worst of all is the environmental destruction that's happened in this region because of these oil companies. The people living there, in addition to all the other problems I just mentioned, also have to deal with oil spillage, gas flares, acid rain, and other forms of pollution. This is a picture of an oil refinery in Port Harcourt, so you can see what it looks like. All of this is called a resource curse. A resource curse is when a country has really valuable natural resources, like oil. But once they start selling those natural resources, instead of helping the people who live there, it actually starts degrading their society. It's bad for their economy, and it's bad for democracy. Other countries you could say have a resource curse are Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Venezuela. But given that there are countries that have vast natural resources that are very valuable, such as Canada and Botswana and Norway, some people think that the resource curse is actually more indicative of corruption in that country than anything else. The leader of the Niger Delta Volunteer Force summarized the situation in the Niger Delta in this way. He said this in 2004. The Niger Delta is a conquered territory. It is a place of ruthless internal colonization. It is a place where the gun, the tanker, the battleship, and the marauding warplanes are always ready to deal destruction and death. The Niger Delta is the festering sore of the nation. The Niger Delta is a beggar by the roadside. The Niger Delta is a person raped and left for dead in a dark alley. It is a place of deepest sorrow. On December 11th, 1998, the Ijaw Youth Council, which is a civil rights group representing over 40 Ijaw clans, met in the small town of Kayama and issued something called the Kayama Declaration. In issuing the Kayama Declaration, the Ijaw Youth Council was demanding an end to 40 years of this oil drilling on Ijaw land from which Ijaw people were not benefiting at all. In issuing this declaration, they were stating that the land and resources on Ijaw territory should belong to the Ijaw people. And they demanded an end to 40 years of environmental destruction and degradation that they had suffered, as well as economic underdevelopment. And they also articulated their aspirations for the Ijaw people. I would encourage you to read the Kayama Declaration. It's listed in the description under my references. It's very powerful, yet still succinct. It's really great. All of this gives you an idea of where this region was when Gracious David West was about 18 years old. So let's get back to how Gracious David West was a member of something called the Greenlanders. From 1960 till about 1990, Nigeria was mostly ruled by the military. And in the 80s, the only organized groups against the military who were in power were university faculty and student activist groups. There were other groups on campus called university confraternities, which started out kind of like fraternities in the United States. And the military began to realize that they might be able to pit the confraternities against the student activists and the faculty groups that they were afraid of because those groups were against them. So the military started giving these confraternities money and weapons. The weapons were supposed to be used against the other groups, but instead the confraternities would just use them against their rival confraternities instead of against the student activists and the faculty members. In the 1990s, the confraternities began to spill out from the universities and into the actual communities. They became violent gangs called cults. So when we're talking about a Nigerian cult, we're talking about a gang. We're not talking about NXIVM or Children of God or those other cults, although they might also have those in Nigeria too. But in this context, we're talking about a gang. So the cult that Gracious David West was in was called the Greenlanders, and it was a spin-off of a confraternity at the University of Calabar, which was founded in 1984. That cult was called the Supreme Vikings Confraternity, and it was also known as the Adventurers or the Norseman Club of Nigeria. The Greenlanders cult, along with all the other cults, some of which are the Icelanders and the Outlaws, are what is known as street and creek gangs, and they are the main source of violence in these communities in the Niger Delta. One really scary thing about these cults is that in the 1990s and early 2000s, at the time, Nigeria was transitioning into democracy from being under military rule. And so there were all these politicians running against each other, and they would hire these cults to actually kill rival politicians. And then once these politicians were elected, they would also hire the cults to shut down grassroots movements like the Ija Youth Council. The cults try to siphon as much money as they can from the transnational companies that are drilling for oil right there in the Niger Delta. So they do that in a couple of ways. The first way is sometimes they will actually physically get in the way of an operation, and they will force the oil company to pay them in order to get access to whatever that is, if it's a pipeline or some other kind of equipment that they need to get to. Another thing is that the oil companies, in addition to what they pay the federal government, are also supposed to pay leaders of what are called host communities. So the host communities are just the communities in the Niger Delta. And if you become a leader of one of these communities, you can get money from these companies. Over time, those leadership positions became more lucrative, and those people would start hiring cults to take out other people who were vying for those positions. A third way that they do this is they do something called illegal oil bunkering, which basically means they steal oil. So they find a pipeline and they have welders go in at night and make a little hole in the pipeline so that they can get oil out of it whenever they want. It's like a little tapping point. So they steal that oil and they sell it, and it's very lucrative. In fact, it's estimated that about 15% of oil in Nigeria is stolen in this way. This is why the cults fight over territory, because they want as much access to pipelines as they can possibly get, so they can get as much oil as possible and sell it for as much money as they can possibly get. Unfortunately, when they do this, it causes a lot of oil spills, which is really bad for the environment, and it also contaminates drinking water. The police are said to be a combination of unwilling and unable to stop these cults. Very few cult members are arrested, and even fewer than that are actually prosecuted for their crimes. So Gracious David West, when he was in the Greenlanders, he was an armed robber, and he was actually arrested at one point for armed robbery, but the police just ended up letting him go. Just to be clear, the environmental conditions in this region are not an excuse for Gracious David West or anyone else to have been murdering people. Clearly, there are a lot of other people living in these conditions who don't turn out to be murderers. But I thought the context here was important because it shows how Gracious David West went from these lower level crimes to becoming a prolific serial killer. So, as I said earlier, right after he was arrested, Gracious David West was taken straight to the police commander's office, and he actually just confessed everything right there. This is what he had to say. I'm going to read you some of his quotes. "I don't know what comes over me to kill. After I've killed, I feel remorse and I cry for killing. But after that, the irresistible urge to kill comes over me again. I kill alone. Before I strangulated them after lovemaking, I used the knife to cut the hotel bedsheets into a semblance of twine, which I used to bind their hands and feet, and also used the knife to threaten them. I threatened that if they raised alarm, I would kill them with the knife. Out of fear, they kept quiet while I raised the volume of the television set in the hotel room to dwarf any noise from the room. I never kill with the knife. I was a member of the DBAM cult group. I have since repented. I am not killing for any cult group. I just kill. I don't know what comes over me to kill." Now, you notice that he said he kills alone, but we're pretty sure that that's not always true, and so was the police commander. He said this: "The suspect is definitely not alone in these killings, though he had made useful confessions, but the command will go beyond his confessions to ensure that a conclusive end is achieved that serve the interest of justice." And as I mentioned earlier, I did read one news report that said the same day that they arrested Gracious David West, they arrested another man in connection with the killings in Kaduna State, but I couldn't find any more information about that. Gracious David West also confessed that he would steal these women's ATM cards. So he would tie them up and then force them to tell him their PIN so that he could go steal their money after he killed them. He would also steal their phones, and he told the police the two people or organizations that he sold the phones to as well. So Gracious David West was charged with 9 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, but it's believed that he killed up to 18 women. Once he was arrested, things started moving very quickly. He was held in jail for just 33 days before he was arraigned, which is very fast. Initially, he pled guilty, but the presiding judge demanded that there be a trial because of the gravity of the crimes. And after he found out there was going to be a trial, he changed his plea to not guilty and said that it wasn't him in any of the CCTV footage. Wasn't him. So during the trial, a couple of things of note. None of the victims' families came to the trial except for the father of one victim, and I'm not sure which victim that was. And the father came for just the first day and didn't come back, according to what I read. Also, on at least one of the days, Gracious David West's attorney didn't even show up. Every single hotel where there had been one of these murders sent a representative to testify. Also, Gracious David West tried the insanity route. He started barking like a dog at one point to try to make people think he was insane, right there in court. When returning the verdict, Justice Annabelli characterized Gracious David West in this way. He said, "He is a dedicated serial killer, intelligent and educated in his crime. He said, contrary to what the defense representation of Gracious David West tried to do during the trial, he is not an impulsive killer, he's not mentally sick, but meticulously and calculatingly carried out the murder of 11 female victims." He added that Gracious David West was an intelligent, calculative, itinerant sex predator and robber whose mode of killing followed a familiar thread. Gracious David West was found guilty of all counts on October 20th, 2020, and he was sentenced to die by hanging. The death penalty is actually really rare in Nigeria, and the last people who have been executed were executed in 2016. I did think that it was notable that the only evidence they used to convict him was the CCTV footage and his confession. I'm pretty sure I read that they did collect some evidence for DNA purposes at one point, but that didn't come up in the trial, and I think in some other countries it would had to have been part of the trial. There was one other defendant in this case who was acquitted, but her charge was that she had dumped one of the corpses of these murdered women in a dumpster. Another thing about this case was that Gracious David West, at one point, when he was trying to get away from his lifestyle, he joined a church. And the church really tried to help him. They got him a job. But apparently, the job didn't pay enough for him to actually get an apartment, according to him. And so he just went back to his old lifestyle of crime. But while he was with this church, he actually confessed to multiple preachers about what he had done, and none of them told authorities, at least from what I read. In the documentary I watched about this case on YouTube, they interview the public asking what they thought, like whether they thought that these preachers should have told the cops or not about these confessions, and there was kind of a mixed bag of opinions about that. But I would love to know what you think, so let me know in the comments. To me, the scariest thing about Gracious David West is I watched his interview on this documentary, which I have listed in my references, and he seems like not only a perfectly normal person and not some kind of person that you'd want to steer clear of, but he seems really nice. He's really softly spoken. He seems like a nice guy. He seems like someone I would gladly strike up a conversation with if I met him randomly. And that is terrifying. The latest news on Gracious David West is that his attorney is filing an appeal. He's at least trying to get out of the death penalty. And that's all I've heard as of January 2022. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments. So please let me know what you think. That's all I got for you today. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.